And we're back on the Ryan Jespersen Show talking about wildfires in this half hour. Of course, it's dominated a lot of the news cycle in all across Canada. In fact, for the past week or so, the terrible situation that's unfolding in BC this summer. The wildfires there, up to 160 burning at one point, tens of thousands of people forced from their homes, and still thousands more on standby, ready to evacuate at just a moment's notice should the wind shift and the fire start to threaten their community. Williams Lake was evacuated. That was one of the larger centers that was evacuated as firefighters worked to try and save a sawmill in that area. It's been just a terrible summer in the interior of BC as far as forest fires go. And, when you take a look at that and then you put it up against the Fort McMurray fire that we saw a little more than a year ago now, we've always had forest fires in Alberta and BC, all across Canada. In fact, there's always been wildfire risk. But is it getting worse? Is this something that we're seeing more and more of? And is it something that we need to take extra steps to try and protect ourselves from? That's what we're going to talk about with Glenn McGillivray, who is the Managing Director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. And Glenn, I know this is... Well, first of all, thanks for joining us this morning. I appreciate a chance to talk to you. Glenn, are you there?
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. I know this is something that you've looked into and something that you've taken a bit of a look at. When we talk about forest fires, like I said, they happen. I mean, they're nothing new in Canada. We've seen them, right from the beginning. But are they getting worse? Obviously the losses in terms of insurance value is getting higher and higher with Fort McMurray alone. But is the situation overall getting more severe?
It's hard to say. I think there's some science that says that we're not necessarily getting more fires, but there are. We sometimes get bigger fires, and like you say, Canada's a forested country, and we get forest fires, but we have good years and we have bad years. It's very spiky, but I think we can look forward to a future of bigger fire. That's for sure.
Okay, so are we doing what we need to do to get ready for that?
No, we're not. Some provinces are very good at working to mitigate wildfire. British Columbia, Alberta are two provinces that really lead in Canada, I think. There's a program called FireSmart, and FireSmart tells us how to protect communities and individual homes against wildfire. FireSmart is a fantastic program, and we really have to implement it even more than we already have been.
Is it a massive job to implement the FireSmart program, or is it something that, isn't that big of a deal?
There's different levels of it. So when you look at the kind of the broad landscape around a community like the forest, it takes a bit of work to thin that forest to fuel. And that takes a bit of money, a bit of time, and you really need some authorities like government in there doing that work. But then you can also bring FireSmart down to the individual property level, and that's pretty simple to do. And what we're just simply trying to do is keep flammable material away from the home. And that could be anything from the way you landscape the home to the location of wood piles and wood sheds and propane tanks and things of that nature. So it's quite easy and very inexpensive, often free, just to make sure that you don't have flammable material directly around your home.
And is this sort of with the expansion of the cities, we see this, are we moving more and more into areas that typically, if there was a forest fire in years past, it wouldn't have been a big concern for people and their homes, and now we're expanding more into these areas? Is that part of this?
Oh, no doubt about it. More and more people are choosing to live and play and even work in the boreal forest.
Yeah.
We have lots of assets, oil and gas, mining, forestry assets in the forest. A community like Fort McMurray, that's a big community, 88,000 people. You've hit the nail on the head here. People are choosing to live where it's beautiful, and it's also very dangerous.
So what do we need to do as we move into these areas? I know there was a lot of talk in Fort McMurray about the fact that the city was built right up to the edge of that forest. There was really no break between the trees and the houses. Is that something, as we're planning out expansion in these kind of cities, that we need to be aware of and sort of say we need to build some sort of natural buffer in?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to think about whether we should be building there in the first place.
True.
That's risk avoidance. That's number one. If there's kind of no choice, or if there's already well-established communities, fire breaks help. They wouldn't really have helped very much in the case of Fort McMurray,
right?
Because it's the embers from the fire that are blowing far ahead of the fire and igniting things. But the breaks do work. Then we have to start thinking about how we build structures. Is very important. So we really have to look at building code and factor wildfire into building code. And then finally, that whole idea I talked about earlier about fire smarting and making sure there's no flammable material directly around the house.
Now, in researching for this interview, I was checking. You predicted a massive fire in Fort McMurray quite a while before it happened.
Let me tell you, I wrote a blog a few years ago, and I asked the question in the blog, what would happen if fire got into Fort McMurray? Mm-hmm. So that year, 2011, there were two really big fires right outside Fort McMurray, but they didn't reach town. And I was saying that this is not on that many people's radar, but it should be. And sure enough, a few years later, we had the biggest disaster in Canadian history.
Yeah, and Fort McMurray is a city of, 65, 75,000 people, depending on how many people are working in the oil fields. But what about the big cities? You're talking about Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver, places like that. I mean, we don't feel threatened at all by wildfires. Should some of the bigger cities in Canada be concerned about this as well?
Absolutely. I mean, there was a newspaper article earlier this week that Vancouver is getting concerned. They have both grasslands abutting the city, and they also have forests, Stanley Park, places like that. You're right, we don't think about it, but we really should. I mean, if you look at some of the numbers that came out of Fort McMurray, that was from the loss of 8% of that city. If you can imagine a fire getting into a place like Victoria or Vancouver, a place like that, my God, it would be horrendous. And Prince George's of the world, and there are many communities around Canada that we really aren't thinking that much about. And, I mean, historically, we got fire in Fredericton, so yeah, we really have to take a new look at things, I think.
Now, when we're talking about the FireSmart program and things we can do to prevent it, and we mentioned some of the things that homeowners can do and things like that, but as you said, it's really, in terms of stopping this before it happens, is a much bigger situation. Have you had a chance to talk with any government officials or people directly responsible for this kind of work, and are they receptive to making some changes and trying to protect the communities that they're responsible for?
Yeah, I think Fort McMurray really woke up a lot of communities to the risk. There are several that have said, we got to get onto this whole project of thinning fuels around the city. And but what I'm really finding is really nobody's trying to engage the private property owner, and we really have to do that. I mean, you can thin that forest. You can do everything possible in the broader landscape,
right,
and still have a big fire if nothing is done on private properties. And so that's the really big gap here, is engaging private property owners to FireSmart.
Okay, so let's go over it again. I know you mentioned a lot of the things that a private property owner can do. What's the most important thing? I guess it's just getting rid of anything that you can that could prevent, the spread of a fire if it gets close to your property, right?
That's right. So, I mean, where you store things like wood piles, propane tanks, or, if you have a wood fence attached to the side of the home, if you have a wood shed, all that should be out of there. If you have a wood deck, maybe treat it with fire retardant. Cover the sides of it so that embers can't blow under the deck and catch it on fire. Mm-hmm. You got to look at your landscaping. So things like junipers and other flammable plants right beside the house are extremely dangerous. They should be taken down. No mark mulch or pine chips around the house. Those are extremely dangerous as well.
Oh, okay.
And then, keeping the grass nice and watered is very important, and things of that nature. So
these are things your average homeowner can do.
It's just a little bit of elbow grease. It's not a lot of money. It's just a little bit of time. That's all it really is.
Yeah, okay. When we talk about insuring our homes and taking care of our homes and that sort of thing, I don't know if you can answer this question, but is there an insurance consideration if you're doing those kind of things? Is that something that's involved in insurance policies?
It's one of the things that we're talking about here, but in Canada, as well as the United States, there's no separate section of your policy dealing with wildfire. Fire is fire. The policy doesn't differentiate between a normal, say, house fire and a wildfire. So in essence, you're getting wildfire thrown in for free, and so it's not possible to give you a discount for something you're getting for free anyway.
Right, okay.
But we're still talking about it, and hopefully some companies will get on board with offering discounts for fire smarting.
Yeah, only makes sense, right? Now, we see these major events in Fort McMurray and what's going on in BC right now. As awful as they are, you always look for something good to come out of a horrible situation like that. Are the governments involved? I mean, I guess it's too early to talk about BC, but the government of Alberta, have they taken this as something of a wake-up call and said, whoa, we got to make sure this doesn't happen again. We're going to change some policies in the way we do things. Are they using it as a learning opportunity?
Well, I think so. I mean, they're certainly putting more money into FireSmart at this time and getting that out there. I think there's more talk about improving building code and land use planning. Mm-hmm. So there is some discussion out there. There's no question about it.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, so that's positive. But how long that lasts, we always find that there's a window after a catastrophe where things are done, and then the window closes. So hopefully this stays open for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that, we all know in this part of the world all too well how important this is. So I appreciate you taking some time to chat with us this morning, Glenn.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's Glenn McGillivray, who is the Managing Director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. And as I said, we're all very familiar with the Fort McMurray situation that happened a little over a year ago and just how devastating that was. And now we see a very similar situation unfolding in the interior of BC right now. Fortunately, no communities as large as Fort McMurray are being threatened, but a number of smaller ones are. Some people were just allowed to return to their homes last night. They'd been out for 2 weeks. A lot of people in Williams Lake still not allowed back in their homes, and they're waiting to see what's going to happen there. And, well over 150 fires are continuing to burn in the BC interior, and it's having an effect here in Alberta in terms of smoke. We'll talk about that when we come back on the Ryan Jespersen Show right after this on 630 CHED.